In 2017, 28-year-old hiker Evan Mercer set off alone into Yosemite and never came back. His car was found at the trailhead, his food untouched, and despite helicopters, search dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, not a single trace emerged. For 3 years, his family lived with silence. Then a lightning storm split open a massive oak, revealing a collapsed tent hidden inside, with Evan's wallet, gear, and a journal documenting his final fight to survive. He was less than half a mile from safety the entire time. How could someone be so close, yet vanish completely? In August of 2017, the height of Yosemite's summer season, the park was alive with its usual mixture of families, climbers, and backpackers chasing solitude in the high Sierra. Among them was Evan Mercer, a 28-year-old software engineer from Reno, Nevada, who had carved out 3 days for a solo trek into the backcountry. To his friends and coworkers, Evan was known as meticulous, not reckless, not impulsive, but steady and detail-oriented. He loved being outdoors because it was the only place he could quiet the analytical, always working side of his mind. His journals from earlier trips showed a man who approached backpacking like a carefully engineered project. He weighed his gear to the ounce, studied maps with precision, and rehearsed packing lists twice before departure. Which is why, when he failed to return from Yosemite, those who knew him immediately insisted something had gone wrong. Evan had told his roommate, and separately texted his younger sister, that his plan was simple: a loop beginning from the Tuolumne Meadows trailhead, moving along the Cathedral Range, then back by Tuesday evening. Before leaving his car, he wrote a small note and slid it under his windshield wiper. Back by Tuesday. Cathedral Range. It was a small gesture of caution, one he'd done before, his way of reassuring anyone who might stumble across his vehicle that he wasn't lost, just out on an ordinary trip. To most hikers it might have been excessive. To Evan, it was routine. On Monday, a summer thunderstorm rolled over the Sierra. Lightning cracked against granite domes, and sheets of rain swept through the meadows. It was nothing unusual for Yosemite in August, but enough to make travel miserable and visibility poor. Still, no one worried about Evan at that point. He had rain gear, food, and experience. He had handled storms before. Tuesday came, and then Tuesday night. Evan did not come back. His roommate expected him that evening. When Wednesday morning arrived with no word, alarm bells started to ring. Evan's family said he always called the same night he returned from a trip, no exceptions. By Wednesday afternoon, his roommate drove to Tuolumne Meadows. The car was still there, untouched. What unsettled rangers most when they inspected the vehicle was what remained inside. Evan's bare canister, extra food, and even a backup fuel canister were sitting neatly in the trunk. These were items he almost certainly would have carried, especially heading into country known for strict food storage rules and unpredictable weather. For someone as careful as Evan, leaving those supplies behind felt out of character, as if he had either left in haste or changed plans without explanation. A search began that very evening. Rangers swept the nearby trails, calling his name, checking for footprints or broken branches. When nothing turned up, the response escalated quickly. By Thursday morning, helicopters circled overhead, their spotters scanning granite ledges and alpine lakes. Dog teams were deployed into drainages below the Cathedral Range. Volunteers, many of them experienced climbers and hikers from around California, came forward to help. For a week the effort grew. Searchers worked in grid sweeps, radioing in every scrap of cloth or disturbed rock. But each lead fizzled into nothing: a false alarm, a misplaced candy wrapper, a boot print that turned out to belong to someone else. Evan's name appeared in local newspapers, then on national hiking forums. Theories began circulating. Had he been caught in a rockfall or slipped into one of Yosemite's many hidden crevasses? Had he drowned crossing a swollen creek during the storm? By the end of the second week, the official search scaled down. The park had devoted thousands of man-hours, and the likelihood of survival, if Evan was still out there, had dwindled to near zero. His family was devastated, but not convinced. To them, his disappearance didn't fit the narrative of an unprepared hiker lost to the elements. Evan had been careful. He had known his limits. Something about the missing food canister, the abrupt cutoff of communication, and the total absence of physical evidence gnawed at them. As weeks turned into months, the mystery deepened. No gear surfaced, no clothing scraps, no trace of his distinctive red tent. Online discussions grew wilder. Some speculated that Evan had staged his own vanishing, walking away from his life into some deliberate new beginning. Others suggested he had been attacked by wildlife and his remains carried off. But there was no proof, no trail, no closure. For 3 years, Yosemite held its silence. Hikers passed along the same routes Evan once planned to travel, oblivious that just beyond the well-trod trails, his final camp, and the answer to the mystery, waited in hiding. 3 years passed. Seasons cycled through Yosemite, as they always did, heavy snow burying the high country in winter, floods of spring runoff thundering into the Merced, and the crowded summer months when the trails filled with thousands of boots. Hikers came and went, and the story of Evan Mercer's disappearance in 2017 faded into the long list of Yosemite mysteries, those names etched on ranger briefing boards and online forums, but left unsolved, becoming half legend in the backpacking community. His family held small vigils on the anniversary of his departure, but with no body, no belongings, there was no way to mourn properly. For them, it was a grief frozen in time. By 2020, only a handful of search volunteers still spoke of him, and even then his case was just one among many in a park that swallows the lost with frightening regularity. Then, in September of 2020, a freak lightning storm ripped through the western side of Yosemite. Bolts set fire to dry grasslands, and thunder rolled over the valleys, cracking ancient trees that had withstood centuries of weather. In the aftermath, rangers were dispatched for routine surveys, walking drainages and side canyons to assess storm damage. It was on one of these ordinary patrols, near a stretch of the Merced River where the forest pressed in thick and shadowed, that 2 rangers noticed a massive black oak tree split nearly in half. The trunk was hollow, burned in places by lightning, its core blackened like charcoal. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a scarred relic of the storm. But then one ranger spotted the faint corner of synthetic fabric stuffed deep into the hollow, brightened in spots with mildew and weather stains. At first, they thought it was a child's discarded toy tent, or perhaps debris from careless campers. But when they pulled the object free, it unfurled into the collapsed shape of a real backpacking tent, aged, brittle, and yet eerily preserved. The colors were muted by time, the rain fly stiff from years of damp and heat, but inside the tent was something unmistakable. A sleeping bag, carefully rolled. A small camping stove. And wedged inside a side pocket, a leather wallet containing a Nevada driver's license. The name on it stopped the rangers cold, Evan Mercer. The find set off a chain of calls up the park hierarchy within hours. Specialists from the investigative services branch arrived, followed by forensic teams who carefully documented the tree, the tent, and everything inside. How long it had been there was immediately clear from the condition of the gear. The tent poles had corroded, the stove's steel body was streaked with rust, and the sleeping bag was riddled with mold. Yet the placement of it all inside the hollow made sense. For a hiker caught in a storm, the giant tree would have looked like a ready-made shelter, dry, tight against the wind, a cocoon in the forest. But what stunned investigators most was not just the tent, but what lay beneath the roots. Sifting through soil and leaf mold, they recovered fragmented human remains, bone shards, a section of jaw, scraps of clothing fiber. DNA analysis would later confirm the obvious. After 3 years of silence, Yosemite had finally given up Evan Mercer. The discovery triggered a renewed wave of attention. Reporters descended on Yosemite. Headlines framed it as another of the park's haunting mysteries answered at last. But the questions only deepened. Why had searchers in 2017 missed a tent so close to the trail network? Why had no one found even a trace until lightning split open the oak? The hollow had hidden the campsite perfectly, making it invisible from the air and nearly impossible to spot from the ground unless you were standing inches away. It seemed almost cruelly ironic. During the 2017 search, Helicopters had circled overhead for days, hundreds of boots had marched the very drainage, and yet Evan's final camp had been tucked inside a hollow less than a stone's throw from their routes. Among the gear was one more piece of evidence, a small waterproof notebook wrapped carefully in a Ziploc bag, still legible after 3 years in the dark. Inside, written in a steady, deliberate hand, was Evan's journal, a record of his final days. When investigators flipped through the pages, they found not the words of a reckless hiker who wandered into disaster, but a meticulous man recording storms, mistakes, and an ever-shrinking circle of options. His words would turn the discovery from a grim recovery into a story of endurance and quiet tragedy, the final testimony of a man who tried, against every chance, to make it out alive. The journal found inside the hollow tree quickly became the most haunting piece of evidence in Evan Mercer's case. Wrapped in a Ziploc bag, it had survived 3 years of storms, rot, and insects, its pages water-stained at the edges but still legible. Rangers turned each sheet carefully, aware that what they were holding was not just a diary but the only account of his last days alive. The entries began normally enough, written in Evan's precise block handwriting. The first pages described weather conditions: light rain on his first night, a decent pace over Cathedral Pass, a sense of optimism. He noted mileage, elevation gain, the condition of his feet, the kind of methodical details typical of him. But then the tone shifted. On the 3rd day he wrote of storms building earlier than forecasted. Sky black by noon. Thunder close. Took shelter lower than planned. He explained how he left the ridge, dropping into forest to escape the lightning. That descent, a deviation from his intended route, likely sealed his fate. For the next 2 days, his entries grew terse. Lost trail. Map useless under canopy. Circling back but grove looks the same. His compass readings didn't match landmarks. He described crossing the same creek twice without realizing until hours later. To anyone reading, it was clear he was disoriented, his careful system unraveling in the chaos of storm and exhaustion. Then the entries grew more personal. On August 31st he wrote, "Food running low. Stove leaking fuel. Ate last bar this morning. Trying to ration. Later that night. Heard branches breaking. Don't know if deer or just storm. Hard to sleep." By then his handwriting had begun to slant, the letters uneven, suggesting fatigue. But it was the September 1st entry that froze investigators. Found hollow oak. Dry inside. Tent fits if angled. Safer here. Waiting storm out. It was as if the tree had offered him a brief reprieve, a natural shelter. He described the hollow almost with relief, saying it felt like a roof in the forest. He made plans: rest, recover, try for the trail once the skies cleared. That was the last full page. The following morning he managed only a line. "If weather breaks, I'll move." Below it, scribbled in smaller script, almost as an afterthought, was a single fragment. "Made it through the night." And then the pages ended. There were no pleas for rescue, no dramatic farewells, no confession of panic, just the quiet, methodical notes of a man who believed, until the end, that survival was still possible. For his family, reading those words was agonizing. They revealed not recklessness, but persistence. Evan had done what any hiker would: sought shelter, tracked his supplies, waited for the weather to pass. Yet fate had conspired against him: the storm, the descent into thick forest, the decision to hunker down in a hollow that hid him perfectly from rescuers. His journal was not only a record of his survival effort but also a cruel reminder of how close he might have been to safety, and how invisible he became the moment he chose the hollow oak. When investigators revisited the 2017 search in light of Evan Mercer's discovery, the tragedy became sharper, almost unbearable. His hollow tree shelter lay less than half a mile from the main trail that rangers and volunteers had walked dozens of times during the initial operation. Helicopters had flown overhead, dog teams had crossed the drainage, and yet not a single rescuer had spotted the faint outline of his green tent hidden inside the massive oak. It was a case study in how small assumptions, human error, and the scale of Yosemite's wilderness could converge to erase a man from view. The first mistake was strategic. Search managers had built their operation around the belief that Evan had remained high in the Cathedral Range, following the alpine circuit he had described to friends. That assumption dictated where helicopters flew, where maps were gridded, and where volunteers were sent. The forested ravines lower down, the exact places Evan descended to escape lightning, received less attention. To rescuers, it seemed implausible he would abandon his stated route for thick, confusing terrain. But storms do not respect plans, and neither do desperate hikers. The second problem was visibility. In early September, Yosemite's forests are dense and lush, a canopy of oak and pine so thick it can blot out the sky. A helicopter crew flying overhead might pass directly above a bright tent and never glimpse it. In Evan's case, the odds were even worse. His muted green tent, wedged inside a hollow black oak, was nearly invisible even from ground level unless someone was standing at the trunk itself. Rangers later admitted that even if a searcher had walked within 50 feet, they might have missed it, the hollow facing the river, the storm debris camouflaging the site. The third factor was timing. The very storm that drove Evan into the hollow also grounded helicopters for days and washed away fragile signs of passage. Footprints dissolved in mud, broken branches fell beneath new rain, and sent trails for search dogs scattered in runoff. By the time skies cleared, the forest had been reset, as if Evan had never been there. Search teams walking grids could only call his name into silence. Finally, there was human error, subtle but costly. In the second week of the 2017 search, a volunteer reported hearing a faint metallic sound near the Merced drainage, something like a pot clanging in the wind. The report was noted but deprioritized. Managers believed by then Evan would have been higher in the alpine zone if alive. Ironically, the sound could have been his stove or cookware inside the hollow, disturbed by gusts. That single clue, dismissed at the time, now haunted those who had been there. Looking back, experts concluded the search for Evan was neither careless nor incompetent. It was undone by the brutal reality of Yosemite's terrain. A man can vanish within yards of a trail if the timing is wrong, if the weather hides him, if his shelter is just a little too well concealed. Yet the irony was devastating. While rescuers fanned across granite ridges, Evan was hunkered less than 30 minutes' walk from help, scribbling notes in his journal, convinced the storm would break and he could move again. The cruel truth was that safety had been agonizingly close, but invisible all the same. The discovery of Evan Mercer's remains in 2020 did not end his story so much as transform it. Once his gear and journal were recovered, the narrative shifted from mystery to memorial. Rangers cataloged his belongings carefully: the stove, the sleeping bag, the corroded tent poles. But what drew the most attention was the inside flap of the tent. Scratched faintly into the fabric with the tip of a knife or pen was a short line of words: "Made it through the night." Investigators had already seen the same phrase in his journal, written on the final page, but here it was repeated, as if Evan had wanted to mark his survival tangibly, to reassure himself that he was still enduring. The words were simple, but they carried an emotional weight heavier than any long farewell. They told his family he had not given up, that he had fought until his final strength ebbed away. When the news broke publicly, the case spread across headlines and television segments. Evan's disappearance had already drawn attention 3 years earlier, but the revelation that he had been so close to the main trail, hidden only by the cruel geometry of a hollow oak, struck a national chord. Commentators framed it as a lesson in humility before nature, a reminder that the wilderness can conceal tragedy within arm's reach. For his family, however, the coverage was both comfort and torment. They finally had answers, but the answers carried their own cruelty. Evan had not wandered into unreachable terrain or staged an escape. He had simply sheltered in the wrong place at the wrong time, his survival efforts erased by storm and circumstance. In the months after his remains were returned, Evan's parents and sister visited the site. Rangers escorted them along the Merced drainage, pointing out where the oak had split open, where the tent had been wedged all those years. The family stood silently for nearly an hour, some touching the blackened bark, others simply staring at the hollow that had once cradled him. They left a small stone cairn and a laminated photo of Evan smiling on a previous hike. To those who were present, it was one of the most somber pilgrimages they had ever witnessed in the park, a family reclaiming not just a son and brother, but the story of who he was. In the wake of his recovery, his sister launched an initiative called the Hollow Project, dedicated to improving backcountry safety. The nonprofit focused on encouraging hikers to carry GPS locators, register alternate routes with rangers, and invest in lightweight rescue beacons that could mean the difference between life and death. The project quickly gained traction in outdoor circles, not because it preached fear, but because it honored Evan's carefulness. He had not been reckless. He had done nearly everything right. His mistake was small, human, and tragically timed. By turning his story into a cautionary example, his family ensured that others might learn from the circumstances that had hidden him for so long. Today, hikers who pass near the Merced drainage sometimes leave tokens at the base of the split oak, a cairn stone, a scrap of ribbon, a carved initial. It has become an informal memorial, a quiet acknowledgement that even in one of the most well-trodden national parks in America, the wilderness holds secrets and sorrows. Evan Mercer is remembered not as a man who vanished, but as one who endured, who sought shelter, rode his way through storms, and marked his survival in words that still echo years later: "Made it through the night."